Communists of America are hosting Marxist schools in Los Angeles on October 11th and 12th, Chicago on October 25th and 26th, and New York City on November 8th and 9th. These schools of communism will be weekend-long educational deep dives to discuss the fundamentals of Marxist philosophy, revolutionary history, and strategy. Buy your tickets now at the link in the description to secure your spot. The Wall Street Journal and a local Dallas paper just wrote articles about the revolutionary communists of America. They see the rising popularity of socialism and communism and are struggling to understand why 1 out of every 3 people that are under 30 have a favorable view of communism in the United States. To us, it's no wonder that people are sick of capitalism and want a revolution. Our generation has never known peace. We saw the 2008 crisis shatter the stability of the working class, and we've been living in the broken pieces ever since. We now pay more for housing and insurance than millennials, just 1 generation older than us, and we make less than them. College graduates are now more unemployed than the national average. Even when we're putting our heads down and grinding it out, we're still only just getting by. To top it all off, we have grown up watching the imperialist massacres carried out by our ruling class. From Iraq and Afghanistan to the genocide in Gaza, all funded by our tax dollars. And it's not just the youth that are disillusioned with this system. Only 54% of Americans have a positive view of capitalism. 70% said that the American dream no longer holds true or never did. Only 25% think that they have a good chance of improving their standard of living. And that's the lowest figure that's been recorded. The life promised to the working class of this country does not exist. And there is a growing layer in the US that can no longer just sit by and be passive observers of capitalist decline. But the 2 political parties in America have discredited themselves. They are correctly seen as corrupt, cynical tools of the billionaires. Trump, who rode the vote of disillusioned workers and youth, has suffered a 54-point negative swing with Gen Z voters between February and July of 2025, with his youth disapproval peaking at 72%. And despite what the even more discredited Democratic Party says, we are not in a period of fascist takeover. With his reactionary theatrics, Donald Trump is trying to distract the working class from economic pain that will only get worse. In reality, we're entering a period of class struggle. The revolutionary movements in Indonesia and Nepal, the Block Everything protests in France and Italy, will be coming to the United States sooner or later, and we are preparing for that. The youth are looking past the Democrats and Republicans and now see class struggle as the only way out. We want a revolution, and we're building the party that will ensure that that happens. Today, you're going to hear from comrades that are building at college campuses all over the country, not only training themselves, but going out and recruiting people that feel the same way that they do about the state of the world. In the last few weeks, in more than 50 campuses across the country, we have had over 2,500 people sign up to potentially join the revolutionary communists of America. But this is just the beginning. Now comes the real task, to recruit these comrades into the ranks of the party and begin their consolidation in the ideas of Marxism and the methods of Bolshevism. These young people had never been given the opportunity to change the world until now. By building a disciplined network of revolutionaries steeled in Marxist theory, capable of communicating those ideas to the broader working class, we can prepare for revolution. Now let's hear from our comrades in Dallas, Fort Worth, Chicago, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, Seattle, and New York City.
Around this area that I'm standing in, we had 18 comrades intervene at a university fair that they were doing in UNT called Mean Green Fling. We were able to make 90 contacts and sell 27 papers while being out here. We've also been tabling every Monday through Wednesday right over here. Pretty much at every tabling, comrades have gotten around like 10 or so contacts.
The people that are joining us are incredibly energized to go and build, to study theory. One comrade in particular, they're jumping out in front of the table, calling out to people, "Are you sick of capitalism?" It was really incredibly inspiring. Basically, 1 in every 2 people you ask, they hate capitalism and they're very sympathetic to communism. And love to hear what you're saying about fighting the system. Comrades have been putting forth our program, connecting with people on the streets, and showing an option that can actually overthrow the capitalist system in their lifetime. In the past, when we had a good conversation, explained the role of the party, oftentimes we'd ask people, okay, do you want to sign up and write their name on the sheet? We changed this approach, and matching up with the seriousness of our content, we also matched up with the seriousness of our ask. Asking them if they can join right on the spot, if they can join the party, and if not, set up a meeting with them right away. And with that, you can send them an article, or if they buy the paper, you have a concrete plan to actually discuss with them. That gives them a lot of energy to actually build the party, to learn more about our ideas.
We've also just had a very successful public event here in this building. I know it's a church, but that's where we had a pretty successful public event. We had about 10 people that weren't members of the organization show up to the event, recruited one person on the spot, and sold over $154 of press materials here. We've actually recruited 8 people at UNT so far of the fall offensive, and I will say with these 8 people, they're very serious, they're dedicated, and yes, they're paying a day's wage and dues.
That thirst for Marxist literature and a further examination of these ideas was felt this year. One important thing to note is the lack of identity politics in the conversations we were having at the tables. In previous fall offensives, there were these inundations with identity and who you represent, and in this year, those ideas were completely scattered by a more tangible economic concern. People wanted to know if they were going to be fed, housed, if they were going to have careers after college, and we were here to meet them and to let them know that under a socialist, centrally planned economy, those concerns can be met by the working class's efforts. We were able to convince 200 people to have a further discussion on these ideas. Those contacts have been reached out throughout the following weeks, and as of today, we've got 6 new members to the RCA here in Chicago.
We had many students walk up to the table and excitedly ask us, "Are you guys communists?" They saw the hammer and sickle. They saw us tabling out here, and they saw a politically organized and serious professional party organizing along class lines. And so many students saw that and immediately were writing their name on our sign-up sheet and asking us questions about how they can get involved. One student came up to our table and they bought not just the latest issue of the newspaper, they bought the prior 4 issues as well. They walked away with 5 copies of our paper and were telling us how excited they were to read it. And right then and there, we set up a meeting so that we could discuss them getting involved with the party as a full-fledged member. And even students who came up to our table with a general sense of skepticism or confusion or reluctance around the ideas of communism or Marxism, even they were asking questions with a genuine curiosity. Many of these students are incurring tens of thousands of dollars in student loan debt and questioning how valuable is this college education going to be in their economic future. They see the mounting unemployment rate. They see the increasing disparity between the rich and the poor, and were asking us what our proposed solutions are for dealing with these very real problems.
I'm actually honored to be one of the new recruits for the RCA, and I met them just a couple weeks ago, and I spoke to Comrade Christian here. I had never really considered myself a very political person until about the past year. What really pleased me when I saw the group out here standing and talking to people and tabling was about a year and a half ago, we had the encampment in the DePaul Quad, which was busted up, and a lot of students who were in solidarity of Gaza and the genocide against Palestine. They busted it up and they just tore everybody up and sent them all home in the middle of the night. And it was a little horrific. And I think attention needs to be brought and a platform needs to be made here on the campuses and in the schools, in the cities. And there's an untapped group of students who are willing to have their voices be heard and join the RCA, and I think be part of the future.
Here in Minneapolis on the University of Minnesota campus, we had tabling sessions 3 times a week at least. I'm here in front of Kauffman Memorial Union. This is the hub of where the students congregate, and we would often set up tabling sessions in front of the lawn here. I'm kind of over here in the main walkways. Wherever there was foot traffic, that's where the communists were. We also made an effort to poster all over campus and in the surrounding residential area leading up to the public event, which helped us to build ourselves up as the communists on campus. Some students would recognize us from the posters and were enthusiastic to finally connect with us. About halfway through the fall offensive campaign, the university Teamsters went on strike, and I'm standing right in the middle of where there was a ginormous rally for these Teamsters. The strike piqued the interest of many students, and even though the strike didn't last long itself, we were able to fold these events into one another, asking students about the strike and asking the workers about support from the students. This was an opportunity to start political conversations left and right. We did get quite a few contacts over the course of the few weeks. We got at least over 100, and at the present moment, we were able to turn 5 of them into recruits and 1 sustainer. We've also made over $460 in sales, and this was kind of capstoned by our public event, Why You Should Be a Communist. There were at least 10 contacts in total at the event. They all stuck around. We were singing songs afterward, revolutionary songs. We asked 2 to join on the spot, and they did. We asked comrades who came up to the table, why did you walk over? And many of them pointed to our banner that a comrade made: abolish the billionaires, abolish wage slavery, free tuition, free healthcare, free Palestine. One of the new recruits we made here on campus is a comrade who moved from Louisiana. They've been following along with the Against the Stream podcast for a while, and they knew that we had a significant presence in Minneapolis. And when they saw us at a table, they walked up and they said, finally, I found you, when they saw us, and proceeded to join on the spot. They brought in another friend of theirs as well.
I had picked up the State and Revolution and the Spectre of Communism podcast at around the same time. Having those 2 perspectives to kind of build off of and compare to, I think very much helped. And by the time I had finished the book, I was pretty confident that I wanted to join the party and that they had the right ideas.
What was it like listening to it in a world of, confusion, and what kind of drew you to its ideas and its message?
It felt very much like having somebody who knew what they were saying, knew what they were talking about, and was imparting this knowledge that they had collected. And they really gave some analysis of things that I had not previously known about. They talked about things like the Russian Revolution. One that really stuck with me was like the art and culture and the Russian Revolution, something I had not previously considered. And then this very educated, knowledgeable person tell me, this is what happened, this is where things were going, this is why we care, and this is our perspective. It had very cohesive ideas.
What was it like meeting our comrades at the tabling session? What did you feel the first time you saw that hammer and sickle on our paper?
I was working to try to actively find the party because I wanted to join. And so whenever I first saw one of our tabling sessions, I was riding my bike and I rode past them, turned around, parked it, and was like, I need to get y'all's contact information. And everyone was very welcoming. I got the number of one of the members and I talked to them about when the meetings were. I came in, there was a very approachable atmosphere. There was space to talk. Overall, I found it very easy to kind of like voice ideas and try to hammer out my perspective and how that kind of, what the party's perspective was on these things.
I think this shows us the desire for Marxist ideas and for people to change their conditions by joining a revolutionary party.
My name's Ethan. I'm a member of the Revolutionary Communists of America here in Philadelphia, and right now I'm out here on Temple University's campus, where for the past 3 weeks we've been talking to students about the need for revolutionary communism. And really the response that we've gotten has been ecstatic so far. Students are completely fed up, completely angry with climate change, with war and genocide and imperialism, with austerity cuts, the cuts to our public transportation system all around us. I could keep going on and on. But it's been to the point where at our very first tabling, before we were even set up, someone, a student on campus, leapt up to us and was like, are you guys the Temple Communists? I've been looking for you guys. And this is the kind of mood we've been met with to try and connect with this radical mood, especially amongst the youth. And for the first 2 weeks, we tabled very intensely on campus, 2 or 3 times every single day. We have talked with an untold hundreds, maybe even thousands of students here on campus. We've made over 180 signups, sold over 160 papers, and already recruited 5 new communists here at Temple into our ranks, with many more on the way. We had multiple discussions on the most recent issue of The Communist, issue number 16. It has the questions students are having, like on reformism and Zoran Mamdani, or what would a communist America look like? What kind of party are we recruiting students to? Are we recruiting them to, a book club, a reading group, or maybe just, some kind of student organization like all the others? Or are we recruiting them to a serious professional revolutionary party that treats them like adults? Our first public meeting that we had just this past week, which was called Why You Should Be a Revolutionary Communist. And I think this was a big success. 15 really high quality contacts came out to it, all of which were enthralled in the political discussion, and 2 of which joined right on the spot after the meeting. And I think the morale was very high in the room. And this is only the beginning. We have a second public meeting planned in a couple of weeks from now on reform versus revolution. We have the New York Marxist School. We're trying to bring as many students here on campus out to as possible in November. How do we need to advertise this? We need to take these posters and we need to go out to our periphery. All these signups and contacts that we've made, all the new comrades that we've recruited, put these posters in their hands and say, hey, do you have any friends that are going to be interested in this meeting? Can you go into your classroom and ask your teacher if you can shout out this meeting that you're really excited for? Really, one, gets the students to spread the word amongst the rest of the student body themselves. And then two, this also serves another purpose of immediately wrapping up all of our new contacts and recruits into the practical activity of building the party. We've established a super definite presence here on campus. Whether they agree with us yet or not, every single student out here knows that the communists are here. Boldly, they know that if they want to go to any kind of radical, leftist, communist organization, it's going to be us.
Comrades, I want to take a quick moment out of the episode to remind you to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, please send them down in the comment section. We're not content creators. We're not doing this to make ad money on YouTube. We're on this platform so that we can give Marxist ideas to the communist layer in society and recruit them to the revolutionary communists of America. So again, like, subscribe, and comment on the videos, and share this video with who you think might be interested in joining the revolutionary communists of America. If you haven't joined the party, go down into the description of this video and click the link communistusa.org/join.
Hey, the Seattle Communists are out here on a cold Sunday morning talking to students and workers as they commute about their day and explain to them what capitalism is and how it's not going to be able to solve their problems, why we need a genuine communist party in order to fight against the Republicans, against the Democrats, and actually represent the workers. And a lot of people are open to those ideas. We've gotten 4 sales, we've gotten a contact, and we've had some really good conversations with people. So we're really excited to continue our fall offensive and head back onto campus once the students get back.
Here in New York, the fall offensive has been great. We've been targeting campuses in 4 out of the 5 boroughs, and from what I can tell, it seems like everywhere we've targeted, there's been a general enthusiasm for communism, but more so, people have been very curious about communism and asking very fundamental questions that we are excited to answer. And this, of course, makes all the sense in the world. In a world dominated by capitalism, only our enemies get to define these things. Most people don't learn about communism from Vladimir Lenin or Karl Marx or your friendly neighborhood communist. They learn about these ideas from Tucker Carlson or Jesse Waters or what have you, Fox News. So a lot of people have been coming up to us and asking us for, the perspective on these issues from a communist. We've recruited over 20 new dues payers at an average of over $50 dues. I know that in Brooklyn we recruited 5 new members, one of whom is a college student, which is very, very good. In Queens, we recruited 3 new students and more members on top of that. In the Bronx, we now have a series of active contacts, and we have a series of active contacts, people who are likely to join soon in a high school, which is quite exciting. And then the big news from New York is that we now have our first actual foothold at NYU. We have a branch there, and we had a public meeting in which 16 contacts attended. It went very, very well. We had a lead off on why you should be a communist, and a lively discussion that followed on all types of questions, like what happened in the Soviet Union, what about China, all of these kinds of things. It was very, very good and engaging. And now we're probably going to end up dividing the Manhattan branch from 1 into 2.
We're doing the fall offensive at a high school for the first time in New York City this year. And a couple of weeks ago, we set up our table with the RCA banner on the corner of the high school. And as the students passed by when they were let out of school, a lot of them stopped by our table to ask questions. There's a lot of curiosity around these ideas. What is communism? How is it different from socialism? What is capitalism? And at one point, there was a group of freshmen and sophomores who started to chant communism, and eventually there was a mosh pit formed around our table. But outside of all of that enthusiasm, there are people who are looking to get involved. We've had serious conversations. One of the people followed us and asked us questions for a full hour, and even joined us at the social afterwards to ask us about imperialism and the role that US imperialism has played. We have a high school comrade who's working really hard to build in his high school. He's been talking about these ideas with his friends, and one of his friends has actually already come to one of our branch meetings, and we recruited him as well. So this goes to show you that the youth is hungry for these ideas. They're looking to get involved, and as long as we're going out there and connecting with them, we have the potential to grow into a sizable force, hopefully relatively quickly.
Why am I a communist? A lot of different reasons. Like, the main reason would be related to like my experience and my family's experience with healthcare in the United States. I mean, healthcare for profit. I start to realize why people distrust medicine. It's because of the profit incentive. Anything that could make a positive difference or is supposed to help people was really corrupted by the profit motive. The first time that I met the comrades, I was on the quad. When I first passed them, I was like, I kind of want to say something, but I was like nervous, like, what do I say? They were like saying, are you tired of capitalism? I am, so that really caught my attention. And I went back past them, and then I went back and I was talking to them. I talked about a lot of anger that I had, a lot of grievances, a lot of things in the world that are like so depressing, things that I have been thinking about for a really long time. And they were talking about like solutions.
We're not done yet, right? The point is that the fall offensive has kind of opened the floodgates for interest, contacts, activity. Now we are really reaping what we've sown, and we're still actively recruiting and channeling all of this energy into actually building the party.
Today, the RCA is a small force on the political landscape, but history is on our side. This process won't be a straight line to victory, but our message will resonate more and more in the years ahead. It's a process that the ruling class is unable to stop. Right now, it's up to the cadres of the Revolutionary Communist International, armed with Marxist ideas, to carry that process to its revolutionary conclusion.
The famous quote, which I'm going to read now, where Marx and Engels write, "The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them." And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. So these ideas were already in Marx's mind and developed in a more thorough way over his career. So it's our task to study Marx's writings, to understand capitalism, see why the downfall of the system is inevitable, and also understand that there is nothing the ruling class can do to fix it. There's nothing the ruling class can do to make capitalism a more humane, a nicer system. This doesn't mean, by the way, that the victory of the working class is inevitable. That's a different topic, right? The working class, in order to take power and transform society, needs a leadership, and we have to build it. So there's nothing automatic about that. But the other part is also true, that inevitably capitalism will go to crisis, will fall apart, it will bring humanity down unless the working class overthrows it and changes society. So when Marx started looking at capitalism, he looked at the foundation of capitalism, and that is commodity production and commodity circulation, right? So the first thing Marx does in Capital is he examines a commodity. And he says every commodity has a use value and it has an exchange value. So, first of all, we'll talk about commodities, things that you're going to sell, right? So that could be, for example, a bottle of wine. It could be some corn. It could be a pair of shoes. It can also be a service like airline tickets. They're the commodity is it's going to move the body from California to New York or back. But basically, he's looking at that commodity and he says every commodity has a use value. Like the use value, do I want the wine? I want the wine so I can drink it. I need the pair of shoes so I can wear it. I need the corn so I can eat it. I need the airline tickets because I got to get to New York from California, right? So every commodity has a use value. But in the question of exchanging these commodities, there has to be something, if you're going to determine what something is worth, what its value is, there has to be something that these commodities have in common, right? And at first look, right, you think, what would a bottle of wine and a pair of shoes have in common? But there is something in common to them. And that is that the shoes don't make themselves. The shoes have to be manufactured. The bottle of wine, you have to, plant the grapes, or pick the grapes, dry, I don't know what the process, stamp on the grapes, whatever. That's the old way they do it, right? Ferment the wines. Human labor is necessary to transform and make that wine and bottle it. Human labor is necessary in order to manufacture a pair of shoes, right? So there's in each commodity, you do have something that's similar, and that is human labor. Now, it's different kinds of human labor. We understand that. It takes a different kind of labor to manufacture shoes than it does to pick a grape or to make wine. But ultimately, there is an exertion. What they have in common is an exertion of labor power. So when you look at the exchange of commodities, right, the question of what they're going to be exchanged at, you have to look at the value. And if you want to examine the value, you have to look at the question of labor power. So Marx said that basically, and by the way, he drew this from the classical bourgeois economist. It wasn't him who developed it, but it's the average socially necessary labor time that's needed to replace a commodity. That's how we define the value of a commodity. It's not so much how much labor was put in to manufacture this phone, but the value of this phone depends on how much of the average socially necessary labor time is needed to replace this phone. Because over time, as labor productivity increases, a value of a commodity can go down because less labor is needed. And he describes that first circulation process of commodities as commodity, money, commodity. Meaning, basically, take a farmer, he has a whole bunch of corn, he eats some of the corn, but then he's going to sell the rest. If he sells some corn, he uses it to buy a bottle of wine. He sells some more corn, he uses it to buy some shoes. So the commodity gets transformed into money. The money then gets transformed into the new commodity that he buys, right? But then Marx also says, let's take a look at the other side of this circulation. Because you have people who are in the business of producing commodities. And from their point of view, the people who are producing the commodities, who are doing it for money, they start with a certain sum of money. They use that money to manufacture commodities, and then they sell those commodities. At the end of the process, he calls this MCM, but it's MCM prime, at least that's the ideal. It may not always work out that way, but that's the ideal. Because you start out with a certain sum of money, create the commodities, and then hopefully you're selling it for more money. At the end of MCM prime, you have more money than you started with. Now that idea of circulation, money, commodity, money prime, more, the money plus the surplus value. This is really what defines capitalism. Capitalism is a system where the means of production, the mode of production, is based on the production of more and more money, capital, right? That's the whole point. Capitalism, by the way, we should be clear about this. The capitalist ruling class obviously lives much better than the rest of us. They have tremendous privilege and they have tremendous political power. but they don't control their own system. That's an important thing to understand. They do not have a conscious control of the system. The system works independently of what they want it to do. So this system, take the money, invest the money, produce commodities, and then hopefully get more money back. That operates, you could say, independently of what they may or may not want it to do. So eventually, you look at this increase in money, you go from money to money prime. And where does that increase in money come from? Well, it comes from an increase in the value of the commodities that are sold, right? There had to be some value created in the production process. So Marx explains that's where that increased value, that's just where the capitalists are generating more money, is that they're producing these commodities. They're adding value. The value is being added in the production of these commodities. And as a result, that's why they're able to get more money. But there's another important concept. It looks very subtle, but it's something we have to understand. The value of these commodities is added in the production process. That's true. But it's not realized in the production process. It's only realized when the capitalist takes that commodity and sells it. So there's two parts to this thing. In order for the capitalist to make more money, it's not just that he has to have the commodities produced and they get the value added in the production process, but he has to realize that through the sale of that commodity, right? If both parts don't happen, we're going to have a problem. We'll get to that in a bit. If you originally, Marx explains, like originally in class, even before class society, when you had exchange of commodities between two different groups of people, you may have exchanged that through barter, for example, right? But inevitably, money develops as in a certain sense as a commodity. It starts as precious metals, gold, silver, copper, and then that eventually evolves into actual money where you coin things and all that. I don't have the time to go into that. But what we'll say is that the establishment of money obviously facilitates the exchange of commodities on a much wider and easier level. Money serves, first of all, as a measure of value, right? So when you want to evaluate what is this phone worth, right? We don't have to say, well, I don't know, how many chickens, would you have to exchange for this phone? Or how many cars? Or, you could just use money. You could use the price of something that facilitates that as a measure of value. Also, money becomes a means of purchase and a means of payment, right? Imagine like if you had to buy a car and you had to you were, paying for it in cans of paint. I don't know how many truckloads of paint you'd have to give to the car dealer. Obviously, you couldn't have the kind of commodity circulation that's necessary in that kind of barter system. So money evolved, and it actually evolved even before capitalism, but it allows and facilitates the circulation of capital. But money, of course, it's a measure of value, it's a means of purchase, it's a means of payment, but we also can look at money as capital. What do we mean specifically as money as capital? Money as capital is money that's spent to make more money. So let's give an example, a couple examples, right? Someone buys a pair of shoes for them to wear. That's not capital. That's not money as capital. Someone says, I want a car. I want a car because I want to go on vacation or need to use it to go to work or something like that. They purchase that car. That is not capital. Well, let's say someone says, I want to buy a car because I want to go into the taxi business, right? I'm going to buy that car and use it to make money. Now, that money, you could say, is capital. It's a capital investment. You're investing in that car, not for personal use, but you're going to invest that in that car to be able to go into the taxi business and make money from it. So whenever you're investing money, that M prime, whenever you're investing money to make more money, that's when you see money as capital. And there are different forms of capital, right? There's industrial capital, which is invested to produce things in manufacturing and industry. You also have merchant capital, because remember, we just said that if you may make a surplus value, you may increase the value through labor in the production process of a commodity, but you can't realize it until you sell it. So somebody's got to sell that, and that's the merchant. So there's merchant capital. And then, of course, there's also money capital in the form of interest, right? When the banks loan money and they get because they're giving you that money for a time, you have to pay that back, and you have to pay it back with interest. In the question of industrial and merchant capital, obviously there's some sharing here of the surplus value, right? Like when General Motors manufactures cars, nobody says, well, I got to buy a new car. Let me go to the General Motors factory in Detroit to buy that car. Nobody does that, right? You go to the car dealer, right? So that means the industrial capitalist has to kind of share some of that surplus value with these car dealers, right? They ship their cars that they manufacture to the dealers, and the dealers are able to sell the car, and that's how they're able to realize the value. So there's some sharing up of that surplus value. Under capitalism, what we should understand is that there's this concept of productive labor. Productive labor is the labor that the capitalist is putting into the process to create surplus value, right? If you have unproductive labor under capitalism, you're talking about labor that's not producing surplus value. It's not a moral question. We're not saying that someone who is involved in unproductive labor is doing something bad or not doing a worthy task. If you take a look at like the public school system, and you look at teachers, like we have teachers here who teach me, that's a necessary thing. They are obviously providing necessary infrastructure in order for capitalism to function. But in the public school system, which is based on taxation, those teachers are not producing surplus value. So from a point of view of capitalism, that's not productive labor. It may be necessary in order for their society to function, but it's not productive labor. So it's not a moral thing. Those workers are not creating surplus value. By the way, theoretically, that point is something we have to consider, because when you have a strike of the public sector workers, right, we may be able to interfere with public services that are wanted and needed and valued, but it's not stopping the production of surplus value. That we have to be clear about that. And it's a different equation, obviously, when you're fighting for that, because you can't say, well, we want the profits of the school system. Yes, if you had a private school, if the private school was making money, then that may be considered productive labor, but it's not in a state-run school. So the capitalists, when they're investing in the production process, there's two forms of capital that they're investing in. One is called constant capital, and the other one is called variable capital. Now, constant capital is any investment that the capitalist is using other than labor, right? And variable capital is the investment in labor power. Now, what is the difference? Why does Marx call all non-labor capital investment constant capital? He calls it constant capital because the value of the constant capital does not increase. It does not change. It transforms itself. It's transformed in the production process by labor, but it doesn't change value. So, for example, if you're manufacturing shoes and you use leather for the shoes, the investment in leather is an example of constant capital. That value of that leather is going to be transformed in the productive process from, whatever you call raw leather. I don't know what leather hides, whatever they buy it in. They take that, and then it will get transformed into the value of the shoe. The value will stay the same. It's like an algebraic equation. You got, x over here, minus x over here, and you have to minus x on this side. It changes form, but the amount doesn't increase. What increases the value of the shoe is that the whole process of who's using that constant capital, who's using that constant capital and transforming that raw material into new commodities and new products. That's variable capital. That's labor power. It's the worker that creates new value. So all new value, this is also not only an important concept, but whenever you bring this up to a bourgeois or petty bourgeois, even certain layers of the labor movement, I've found, whenever you bring this up, it can send them into a tizzy. It sends them into a panic, right? That idea that all new value is created by labor. It's not the capitalist that created it. It's the worker that creates that in the production process. That's how new value is created. Now, variable capital, labor power, right? The capitalist needs to invest in that. He needs to employ in that, because without that, nothing is going to work. And then that comes to the question, how does the capitalist purchase that labor power, right? Well, the first thing is he needs a proletariat. He needs a workforce. He needs these free workers. And the capitalist, Marx explains, the capitalist and the worker kind of meet on a plane. It's like the capitalist wants to buy the commodity, variable capital, labor power. The worker wants to sell the commodity, his labor power, to the capitalist. Now, in order for this to happen, you have to have that working class. That means you need free workers. When we say free workers, they're free of two things, right? They're not slaves, they're not serfs, so they're free of that kind of domination. They basically are available to work for that capitalist. But there's another freedom that they have. They're free of owning any means of production, right? In order to survive, they've got to sell their labor because they don't have anything else. It's not like they own a business and they're making money through the business. They have nothing else. In order to eat today, I've got to get it paid. I need wages. I got to do something. And that means I got to work for this capital. So they're free in both of those respects. And then the question, thank you. And then the question is, well, what determines the price of the value of labor power? And Marx goes into this and he explains it in Capital. He says, the value of labor power is determined as in the case of every other commodity by labor time necessary for the production and consequently also the reproduction of this specific article, right? You gotta remember that since you're employing human beings do not live forever, and human beings are not always in the health, at their later stage may not even be of the sufficient health to be able to work in the production process. So you need to be able to replace human labor. So the value of labor power is determined, as in the case of every other commodity, by labor time necessary for the production and consequently also the reproduction of this specific article. Then he goes on later on. He says, on the other hand, the number and extent of his so-called necessary requirements, the necessary requirements for the labor power to exist, the worker to exist, as also in the manner in which they are satisfied, are themselves products of history and depend therefore to a great extent on the level of civilization attained by a country. In particular, they depend on the conditions in which, and consequently on the habits and expectations with which the class of free workers have been formed. What that means is what it takes to keep a worker alive and to reproduce the next generation of labor, that depends on which time period in history you're looking at, and depends on which particular country you're looking at, and in some cases even depending on which region you're looking at. Wages and benefits, in other words, are determined by the average socially necessary labor power necessary to sustain a worker and their family, create the next generation of workers, and that this level of wages and benefits is linked to the specific country and location where the workers live and the historical time period. I'll give you an example. I was born and raised in Manchester, New Hampshire. You go there, you see all these red brick buildings. Those are the old mills. The reason, by the way, that town used to be called Deerfield. Why it became called Manchester was because the Amoskeag Mills built a huge textile. At the time, it was the biggest textile production process I think in the world. They named it after Manchester because Manchester, England, was famous for textiles and all that. And next to these red brick buildings, these mills, you have these other red brick buildings. These were the apartments that the workers lived in. In those days, to work meant you just got up and you walk across the street and you're in the factory. You didn't need a car. So when you look at the wages of the workers at that time, workers didn't need to have a car. Now, if you live in Manchester, all those mills are closed. There's other things there, but they're not manufacturing. Now, if you live in a place like Manchester, there's no public transit. And within the context of the workers' wages, workers absolutely need a car because you're not going to be able to get around, even buy your groceries, get to and from work without a car. So the different time periods, right, would determine different kinds of wage and benefit levels for the worker. And then what happens is the capitalist, based on that price of labor, he pays the worker, a daily wage, weekly wage, whatever. And that worker works for a certain period of time. And it's possible that maybe that worker in 4 hours, maybe in some cases in less than 4 hours, he's able to produce enough value that it's equal to the wages and benefits that the capitalist paid to him. So what does the capitalist do? Now he's paid this worker to work for him for a day, right? So he's not interested in having the worker work, have that worker create enough value to pay his wages and benefits, and then say, okay, go home, take the rest of the day off. No. He wants him to stay there. He wants him to continue working. And as he continues to work, the worker continues to create new value, right? New commodities. As a result of this, at the end of the day, the worker, in terms of the amount of value he's created, it's created more value than what would be paid out in wages and benefits. That value we call surplus value, right? Now, Marx explains that how surplus, it gets into a complicated thing of how surplus value is distributed, right? Some of it goes to the rent that the businessman has to pay for his factory. Some of it has to go to interest because the businessman had to take a loan from the bank to pay the wages ahead of time, because remember, just because the commodities are made, that doesn't mean it hasn't been sold yet. He's not going to sell it for another couple of months. He won't get that money for another. He's got to take out some loans. He's got to pay that back. Some of the surplus value goes to rent. Some of it goes to interest. A lot of it goes to profit. Even the profit, remember, he must share with the merchant capitalist and all that. So it's not a quick and easy thing. But the thing is that we have to see from this process is immediately, because the businessman needs the worker to produce that surplus value, immediately in this production process, capitalism is creating commodities that represent more value that can be purchased by the working class, right? Because it just added up, right? If the worker is producing more in value than he's getting back in wages and benefits, you just know if you were doing a balance sheet, there's no way that the working class could buy back all the value that they're creating. So under capitalism, immediately in the production process, there is overproduction. What we're not saying is there's a crisis of overproduction. We'll get into that in a second. But immediately at day one, you have overproduction. Now, the thing is if you always have overproduction, why is there a crisis of overproduction? Well, what the capitalists do when they get the surplus value is a lot of people like moralists, reformists will say, oh, the capitalists, they're living high on the hog. They're living well. They're living with all those profits. The capitalists actually live on a very small percentage of profits. The fact that they live high on the hog just shows you how much money they're making. You want to talk about people and wealthy people and what they live on. A famous example, of course, is Warren Buffett, right? I remember seeing this guy's one of the richest men in the world, multi-billionaire, and they showed a day in his life. And here he is in Omaha, driving to the McDonald's drive-in at the beginning of the day, seriously. And he buys an Egg McMuffin that he takes to the office, and then he has a refrigerator filled with Coke, And he doesn't even have a driver. He drives himself, So you can see, very frugal guy, lives on a very, very small percentage of the money that he's reaping. But that's in one form or another. The capitalists live on a very small percentage of that surplus value. What they do is they take most of that surplus value and it goes back into the circulation. Money, commodities, money prime, right? It's an endless cycle. You want more. Too much is never enough, right? It's just an endless thing to do that. And as a result, the capitalists reinvest. And why do they reinvest? They don't want to just keep production as it is. They want to expand production, right? If I'm making this amount of money with this factory A, if I open factory B, I'll increase my profits by that much more. I'll get more surplus value. The capitalists want to continue the expansion. Part of what they're doing also is they're in competition with their rivals, right? They want to get a higher amount of market share. They want to drive their rivals out of business. Maybe they want to get to a point where they can buy out their rivals, or they'll drive their rivals into bankruptcy, and they'll have monopoly or near monopoly control of that industry. So there's always a constant ferment in capitalism. Take that money, reinvest that money, look for ways of reducing the cost of labor through increasing productivity, which means to get more fancy machinery, more constant capital as a way to outcompete your competitor, to make your product better and cheaper than your competitor does. As a result, when you multiply that times all the capitalists, you have a tremendous expanse of capitalism, a tremendous expansion of production. And basically, and it also leads to obviously an expansion of labor productivity as more and more machines are used, more and more technique is used in order to have less labor time necessary to produce a given commodity. Of course, there are many examples of that, but of course, one of the giant steps in that was when they, like, for example, when Henry Ford developed the assembly line. Like originally a car, you'd have these skilled workers, they'd build it from top to bottom. They'd all work on, like, I don't know, 6, 10 guys, whatever. They work on it top to bottom. But then he said, no, we're going to have this big factory, big line. All you do is one thing. You might put the wheel on the front, and someone else puts the door on. And by doing that, they were able, of course, to reduce the amount of labor necessary in order to make that car. They dropped the value of the car. Now, I also want to point out something. Again, a very subtle thing, but it's something we should think about. A byproduct of capitalist expansion, and Marx goes into this even in the Communist Manifesto. The capitalists, in order to make all this money, they must create the work. Thank you. They must create the working class, right? They have to hire these workers. They have to put them together. They have to socialize them in industry. So the capitalists are creating the working class. The capitalists are ultimately creating their gravediggers. But also the other side is true. The working class creates the capitalist class, right? Because how many workers do you have to employ to be a capitalist? I like, Laura was able to provide some facts and figures in her article about if America should go communist, right? She mentions in the article there's like 33 million businesses in the United States, roughly 33 million, but only 6 million of these businesses employ people, right? And she said 90% of these businesses have fewer than 20 workers. Hey, if you're a capitalist, if you only employ 20 workers, are you really a capitalist? You're probably petty bourgeois, right? You're a small guy, it's small potatoes, right? But let's say, I don't know where you want to, it's kind of arbitrary maybe, where we have the cutoff where quantity turns into quality. But she goes on and says, if you take a look, this 0.33% of the businesses will be like less than 110,000 businesses out of that 33 million employ 500 or more employees. Is that the cutoff? Would you say if you employ 500 or more employees, you're a capitalist? I don't know. It may be somewhat arbitrary, but it gives you a sense. In order to make a capitalist, the capitalist must create the working class. But as he creates the working class, as he gets more and more employees, that's what makes him, that's what transforms him from the petty bourgeois into a capitalist, into someone who has lots of money. So we have, as a result of money, commodity, and money prime, as a result, we have the rise of capitalism. We have the productive forces, and the productive forces are developed way beyond the level they were developed entering into the historical phase, historical epoch of capitalism. And what are the productive forces? We're talking about the means of labor, but also labor power, right? The proletariat, the socialization of industry, to take industry from the homes, put it together into these big factories with industry, even on a retail basis in some ways. Look at what Amazon has done, right? It's eliminating the small mom and pop, but it's also even eliminating department stores, which themselves were a step towards socializing the merchant side of industry, right? And now you have it centralized in these huge warehouses and distribution things. So the byproduct of capitalism is that it develops the means of production, and it creates this situation where you have a very large proletariat. The proletarianization of the population, remember the proletariat, variable capital, that's developing, as you proletarianize, that's the development of the productive forces. The development of the means of production, and distribution are also part of that. I mean, of course, I don't think there's anyone here who would dispute this, but to when you look at things from that perspective, it's kind of hard to believe that if we would say 1938 to now, they'd say, no, there hasn't been any development of the productive force. There's been proletarianization. That in and of itself is an example of the development of productive forces since 1938. But anyways, we won't go into that. Within capitalism, Marx explains, gets into the second volume of Capital. He talks about breaking capitalism down into what he calls two departments, right? One department is the production of the means of consumption, right? Department one, if you want to say that. Then there's another department, another part of the economy, which is the production of the means of production, capital good, right? Now, what are the relations between these two? I also want to mention these two areas, right? Because of the way capitalism functions according to a market. It's not a nationalized planned economy. So the relations or the connection between these two industries is based on market and exchange, right? It's not based on a plan. So with the means of production, what you're doing is you're producing capital goods that are either used to produce other capital goods, or they're used to produce consumer goods. And then, of course, in the Department of Consumer Goods is you're producing consumer goods directly to sell to the consumer, which is mostly made up of the working class, but also includes the petty bourgeois, and obviously the bourgeois do purchase some consumer goods. So out of this, over time, the capitalists are competing against each other. They're trying to defeat their rivals in this competition, drive them out of business. So you have the cycles of capitalism, right? The ups and downs of the business cycle. But besides the ups and downs of each individual cycle, you have overall trends in development of capitalism, right? What is the overall trajectory? And then when you look at that, like when you look at a situation where the ups and downs are overall moving in an upward position, we would call that an upswing. For example, the post-World War II boom in the United States, where you go from 1945 to 1973, where, yes, there were lots of recessions and stuff like that. But if you look at the overall trajectory, overall things were going up. So what you had in that situation is, for the most part, the capitalists were taking the surplus value and reinvesting it in production. And you had an expansion of production during that period. Of course, all good things come to an end. Dialectics tells us things turn into their opposite. At some stage, the continued production of, as we said, on day one, you have overproduction. Eventually, through all this competition, the expansion of production, things get out of hand. There becomes a point where the capitalists are not able to sell everything they produce, or from their predictions, they can see that if they keep producing the way they're doing, they're not going to be able to sell everything that they produce. As a result, this can lead to a downturn and a slump. It leads to a serious, crisis of overproduction. In this sense, quantity is turned into quality, and this is what we saw, for example, beginning in the mid-70s in the United States with the end of the post-war boom. Just to show you concretely, by the way, Antonio actually has a lot of these very good graphs, which I think illustrate the post-war boom and the period after. He was showing that. But I have some other figures I just wanted to mention. For example, in the 1960s, this is in that decade, there were 4 out of 10 years in the 1960s where the gross domestic product of the United States grew by 5.8% or more. I think 3 of those years it was over 6%. 5.8% or more, 4 out of the 10 years. Then you see the 70s, the growth is lower than the 60s. Then you look at the 80s and you see the growth is lower than the 80s. After 1984, we're talking about a period of 41 years. In 41 years after 1984, there was only one single year where the GDP growth was above 5.8%. Only one single year. And you know what year it was? 2021, COVID. What happened is they manufactured that, collapse of shutdown of the economy because they had to keep everyone home, right? And then, of course, then they sent in a lot of money to stimulate it. So the GDP grew when we were coming out of COVID. But except for 2021, in 41 years, not 1 year did you see GDP growth above 5.8%. Yet in the 1960s, you had 4 such years. That's a sign of the problems, of the serious crisis, of the serious slump, of the trajectory going down in capitalism. Quantity has turned into quality. They're in a serious problem of overproduction. Now, Ted, when we look at the post-war boom, right? We are not of the persuasion that the post-war boom was a negative thing, a bad thing. There's positive and negative from it. Ted mentions this. He says, from the viewpoint of Marxism, the economic revival of capitalism, which is talking about the post-war boom, is not a negative phenomena only. It enormously strengthened the numbers and cohesions of the working class and of the position of the working class within the nation. The next break in the economic conjuncture will pose even greater problems in front of capitalism than in the past. I want to point out, he wrote that in 1959, but it obviously predicted exactly what was going to happen in the sense, not when it was going to happen, but what was going to happen. Because once you start with the end of the post-war boom in the mid-70s and onwards, it's been a very, very negative experience for capitalism, American capitalism in particular. They have not been able to solve any of these fundamental problems. Now, if that's fundamentally the problem in capitalism, why it ends up going towards crisis, and why it can't get out of the crisis, let's try to look at and examine some of the things that they do to try to avoid crisis or mitigate crisis. So, for example, debt becomes credit. Thank you. Debt becomes a way of the capitalists trying to solve their credit, or even trying to avoid crisis. With debt and credit, you have consumer credit, where they try to facilitate the consumer to be able to buy these goods and services, these commodities. You have business credit, which is used to facilitate production and the circulation of commodities. And then, of course, you have government debt, government credit. And what that does is that may prevent immediate higher taxes or immediate cuts to infrastructure spending or social service spending, right? But the main thing is that ultimately, are any of these solutions able to solve the problem? And in actual fact, it usually not only doesn't solve the problem, it leads to a bigger problem in the end. Just remember this, under capitalism, you have this constant circulation of commodities. It's kind of a chain. It's absolutely necessary for that thing to keep functioning. Whenever there's an interruption in that circulation of commodities, whatever is the specific cause of that, you can have a crisis. So and there are many different ways to interrupt the circulation of money, commodities, money prime. So Ted says, the fundamental cause of crisis in capitalist society, a phenomena peculiar to capitalist society alone, lies in the inevitable overproduction of both consumer and capital goods for the purposes of capitalist production. There can be all sorts of secondary causes of the crisis, particularly in the period of capitalist development. Partial overproduction in some industries, financial juggling on the stock exchange, inflationary swindles, disproportions in production, and a whole host of others. But the fundamental cause of crisis lies in overproduction. This in turn is caused by the market economy and the division of society into mutually conflicting classes. So what Ted is basically saying, in the end, the main cause of this problem is overproduction. But how it manifests itself in the interruption of that circulation can be different at any particular times. And sometimes it's exactly the efforts of the bourgeois to try to fix problems or mitigate crises that can cause bigger problems, or even specifically can cause a slump at a particular time. I wanted to use an example, is look at 2008 and that major financial crisis. Here, you had a massive use of credit in a lot of different ways. Credit business, credit consumer, credit government, but particularly in housing, right? And as everyone knows, the 2008 crisis was brought about by the mortgage crisis, right? Now, the bourgeois, again, trying to solve their problem of overproduction, trying to get people to buy more homes, right? In order for people to buy homes, they have to be able to afford homes. If they can't afford homes, then you use credit. So they developed a whole series of credit gimmicks. You had liar loans, right? The liar loans, I can just say, yeah, I make this kind of money. I don't have to prove that I make this kind of money. You had second and third mortgages. So I have a home. The home is $200,000 in terms of its equity, but I could take 2-3 mortgages. The bottom line is the total mortgages are worth more than the home. So you're basically giving unsecured credit to people. And you had other things like lines of credit and all this stuff, right? So as a result of this, they knew they were going into a land of tremendous risk that people weren't going to be able to buy. People might not be able to pay these loans back. So they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to mitigate this risk. You know what we're going to do with these mortgages? We're going to bundle them up. Because if you put some of the good ones with some of the bad ones and package it, then one will weigh out the other. And that means don't worry about it. We're going to have no problem on the mortgage market because everything is balanced out. Of course, inevitably what happens is, and also behind this was a famous saying, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard, is you can't lose money on property, right? Everyone hear that? Right? Don't believe it. Yes, you can lose money on property, right? But what happened is when the delinquencies started to mount up, people stopped paying those mortgages, and then all these packaged, collateralized loan packages that they had in the market, they didn't know which ones were really bad or which ones were not bad. Someone described it, one of the capitalist investors described it. It's like, imagine someone selling you a box of wine. There's, how many bottles of wine? 12 bottles in a box? I don't know. Whatever. You got a bottle of wine and says, they're all good, but one of them has poison. Are you going to buy that? And they don't know which bottle has the poison in it. Are you going to buy that? Right? That's what ended up happening, created massive panic. And of course, one thing leads to another because the whole financial system is integrated with each other. One loss leads to another. One fear leads to another. The property values, of course, started to go down. And that meant that even more of the debt was unsecured and panic ensues in the market system. So look at this and examine this. The main thing is not to know the specifics, but the main thing that comes from that is whatever the capitalists do to try to mitigate or postpone the crisis ends up turning back on them. It doesn't solve anything. And of course, you know the enormous amount of government subsidies were put in to prop up the economy. And of course, it limped along. They did prevent a certain type of a collapse, a certain vicious collapse. It could have been a lot worse. But then things limped along for a long time after that. We also have, of course, and we discussed this a little bit yesterday, state intervention in Keynesianism as a solution, right? And so, the idea that the government can borrow money, put that money in the economy, stimulate the economy, and that will solve everything. That will smooth over the peaks and valleys of capitalist economic cycle. So the problem with that, and Ted explains this in What Will There Be a Slump? He says is if you want to spend more but you tax more immediately, then what the government's putting in with one hand, it's taking out with the other hand. But if you're borrowing the money, say, okay, I got around it. I just borrowed the money. I'm not raising taxes. I'm not cutting spending. I'm increasing spending. I'm not increasing taxes. But eventually, the money has to be paid back. How do you pay it back? You're either going to have cuts in social spending, cuts in infrastructure spending, raise taxes, or both. What does that do? That does the opposite of what you just did in terms of stimulating the economy. Ultimately, these are not only theoretical arguments against capitalism, they're arguments against the reformists, why these things will not work. And of course, we also know that when the government throws money into an economy, unless you're in a deep slump and things are really going up, usually if the government's just throwing money in without an equal production of new commodities, that leads to inflation. That becomes another problem that they have to deal with. Here's another thing. Some people, some of the reformists, the trade unions will say this, that, if we raise wages, if only we could, this was even said in the Depression, we could just raise wages, people will have more money, and then that'll get the economy going, they'll stimulate. So of course the capitalists would say, yes, all my competitors, they should all raise the wages. Those workers can start spending, and it will help get the economy going. The problem is, when you get the capitalists in a circle, right, it's a circular firing squad, I guess, to a certain degree, and they say, well, you first, nobody wants to be first, nobody wants to do it. And in fact, if they raise wages, how does that affect things? Well, remember, when the capitalists invest, they're investing in constant capital and variable capital. So if you're given a certain quantity of constant capital and variable capital, if you raise the wages, what does that do? That means you have to put more money in, and it doesn't increase your surplus value, so your rate of profit goes down. So why would a capitalist want to invest when his rate of profits go down? Another factor of investment is capitalists, the secret, don't tell anyone. capitalists want to get the biggest return possible. Okay, and if they have a choice, if they say, if I invest here, I get 1% back. I invest here, I get 10% back. I invest here, I get 20% back. Guess which one they're going to invest in, right? Of course, there's a risk return thing. We know that. But that is a factor in what they do. But here's another thing. This also leads to this point of the tendency of the rate of profit default. Now, I'm not going to go into that in detail unless there's some questions we could discuss it. But basically, we reject this idea that some academic Marxists have, that the tendency of the rate of profit default is a magical formula that can predict when a slump will happen and how long the slump will last. And that's a lot of craziness. What Marx was looking at was he's just saying there's a historical trend that if you look at over time as capitalists are investing and competing against each other, and they're trying to increase the productivity of labor, so they're going to get more machines and AI or whatever to try to reduce the amount of labor. As they do that, what happens is the amount that they invest in constant capital, the amount they invest in variable capital, the proportion shifts towards constant capital. As a result, the surplus, if you look at the ratio of the surplus value over that total investment of constant and variable capital, that starts to go down. The rate of profit goes down. And then there's a question that either there's two things you can draw from that. First of all, the capitalist says, well, if the rate of profit's going down in this business, I'm not going to invest in this business. I'm going to invest in something else. I'm going to speculate the money in Las Vegas or whatever. Look for another way to make his money. That's one issue. Another issue is to do counterattacks against the working class to try to drop wages and benefits. So in actual fact, the pressure is not on the capitalists to raise the wages. The pressure is on the capitalists to drop the wages. So that the actual material reality works against the suggestion that if you just raise wages, that's going to solve the contradictions of capitalism. By the way, when faced with rising wages, there are two things the capitalists can do, and they do both, right? But this idea that, some people say, you don't need a socialist revolution. All you need is unionization. Even the labor notes crowd, some of whom claim to be communists, right? They say, all we have to do is increase union density. Imagine if we had 90% of the industry unionized. The power of that union, they've raised wages. Everything would be fine. Their theory, this is a typical reforms, right? Their theory is we can make life under capitalism pretty good. And socialism would be an even better plus, but we can make life. That's ridiculous. You can't do that. And I'm going to explain why. Because there's two things the capitalists can do. One thing is they can invest in more machinery, eliminate jobs, so you have that greater concentration into constant capital. But another thing is they can move production elsewhere. They can move production to a country which doesn't have the same level of wages and benefits than does the, let's say, the advanced capitalist country with all its unionization. And I'm going to give a concrete example of something. The garment district was noted for having all these sweatshops and tough working conditions. But you know what? They got the unions in. It was actually heavily unionized. So they got some gains in terms of working conditions, wages, and benefits. Oh, wonderful. How did that work out for the garment workers? Well, I moved to New York in 1982. But I found this figure from 1984. In 1984, you had 202,000 employees in the garment district, or garment industry. Some of them were in Chinatown, but most of it was here. 202,000, that's a pretty big workforce. And like I said, when I would come in those days, walk up 7th Avenue, you'd see them that have these rollers and then have all the shirts on there, the pants. And it was also some great lunch places, but that's another story. Those places are also gone. But 202,000 employees in 1984 in the garment district. How did they get rid of those unionized employees? They moved it overseas, right? The garments are made in Pakistan and Bangladesh, Indonesia, wherever they could make it much cheaper. Today, in 2024, 40 years later, the total amount of employees in the garment industry in New York City, only 18,500. Very, very small, very, very small. So this idea that just simply unionizing the workforce and raising wages, that this is going to solve the problem. We don't need a socialist revolution, just need a union, strong union density. Well, they had a union density and what happened to those workers in that industry. But what I want to say is the ruling class in the present situation, I think Trump, on some level, he understands at least this. He doesn't. I don't think he understands the problem is capitalism. That I don't think. I don't think he even understands how capitalism works or anything like that. He himself, by the way, was a very poor businessman. He made his money the old-fashioned way. He inherited it, right? His father actually built a business of residential apartments. He owned a whole bunch of buildings in Brooklyn. He basically inherited that money. But he's mainly made money to the extent he's made it through entertainment and stuff like that. But I think one thing he does understand is the economy is not where he wants it. Thank you. The economy is not where he wants it. And there's one thing I think it's clear. I think somebody read it. I don't know if it was Antonio. Someone read it yesterday about Trump and how he kind of channels this postmodernism. He really believes that reality should reflect his wishes and desires, right? He really believes that. It's not about dealing with the real world as it is. This is the way I want it, so this is the way it is, right? He surrounds himself with yes men. You saw that cabinet meeting, like they're all fawning on him. Oh, the great leader, and the sun was out and it was shining because of you, today, and all that stuff. He gets some bad news from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and he fired the person he had put in there earlier in the year. He said the other day, the Bureau of Labor is going to release statistics. Don't believe it. It's just he knows that these things are not to his liking. So he's trying to take more control over things. We see that with the Federal Reserve and stuff. But for example, whatever power he takes, this is not going to solve the problem. America is not exceptional. He may think it is. It's not exceptional. The American capitalism functions according to the laws of world capitalism, of all capitalism. And there's nothing he can do to fix this system. This system is going down. But what I would say is that some of the things he's doing, I think, are going to be adding to the crisis of American capitalism and adding to the crisis of world capitalism. Because it's true, a lot of the institutions that the bourgeois, the liberal establishment built in the post-war period allowed them to have a certain expansion, allowed them to have a certain power in the world. And by knocking that down, that doesn't solve the problem either. Maintaining those things is impossible. Knocking them down doesn't solve the problem either. It can lead to other problems for them. And I just wanted to read extensively from this article because I thought it was quite interesting about some of the crisis that just comes about by threatening the institutions that the bourgeois have been leaning on in the past. It says, taken together, Trump administration's efforts to expand its influence into spheres that were once insulated from political meddling pose a larger threat, potentially undermining the United States' previously unshakable reputation as a reliable, predictable place to do business. These are all real components of why people would trust the United States. And if you start taking them apart, you start eroding that trust, said Norbert Michael, an economist at the Cato Institute, which, by the way, is a libertarian think tank. At some point, you're no longer the thing that gives people confidence. You're just another third world country. I'm sure Trump's not going to like that, right? Then it says, there's another quote here by Darren Acemoglu. He says, every part of the United States' success, such as it is, the United States as an innovation hub, the United States is a place where people bring their money for safety. Those have all been rooted in some sort of belief and some sort of reality. I like the way he put it, some sort of reality of U.S. courts and U.S. agencies functioning well, said Darren Acemoglu, an economist at MIT who won a Nobel Prize last year for his research on the importance of institutions to economic growth. The United States rebounded from the pandemic-induced recession of 2020 and the inflation crisis that followed much more quickly than most European nations or other similarly advanced economies. Mr. Acemoglu noted the same was true after the global financial crisis of 2008. In both cases, he said, the strong recovery was partly the result of the U.S. economy's reputation as a safe haven, attracting investors willing to lend the federal government money in the form of treasury bonds at low interest rate. That willingness depends on confidence in the long-term reliability of the federal government and its institution. The fact that the U.S. has done so much better than European countries in the last two crises, the financial meltdown of 2008 and COVID, is all because of that, Mr. Ace-Mongu said. The U.S. was able to have more credible monetary policy, and the U.S. was able to use fiscal policy more effectively during both of them. The pieces are interdependent. Investors are willing to lend to the U.S. government because they trust that the Fed will keep inflation under control and won't succumb to political pressure to pump money into the economy to allow further government spending. The Fed, in turn, bases bases interest rates on economic data that policymakers trust to be free of political influence. Good economic data is a bedrock of good policy, said Donald Kahn, who served as vice chair of the Fed during the 2008 financial crisis. All those pieces are now being threatened. This is the final part. But history suggests that fiscal crises are rarely obvious until they are well underway, when they may be impossible to stop. Mr. Michael of the Cato Institute recalled the old line about bankruptcy, that occurs slowly and then all at once. This is his quote, the most likely scenario is that you just start seeing things get chipped away, and then eventually it just kind of blows up, he said. Eventually, it's too much, and the right domino falls, and it's not something you can control. Exactly. Capitalism is not under the control of the capitalist. That's the fundamental problem. MCM. It's independent of MCM prime. It's independent. U.S. imperialism, the fact is, we discussed this also yesterday in the perspective, we'll have less room, not more room to maneuver. The economic crisis, frankly, is going to put the last nail in the political coffin of Trump, of MAGA, and of course, if it brings the Democrats back, it's going to put the nail in their coffin. This is not going to be a wonderful situation for the capitalists. It's not going to be a wonderful situation to live through. But it will undermine all of them. It's going to undermine the social and political confidence that people have in the system, which has already been greatly undermined. It's going to create tremendous opportunity. Now, revolution is inevitable, but the victory of the revolution is not inevitable. We need to build that party. The opportunities are never better than they are today, and they will become even better in the future for us to build. But that takes real work. So, comrades, I think if we start with a basic theoretical understanding of how the system works, why it's in a dead end, and what we can do to build a party to lead the working class to victory. If we do that and we work hard, we'll get there.
But the divisions seem starker now. They're increasingly framed in zero-sum terms. And when I read that, I've been thinking, I've been seeing this phrase about zero-sum. There was the Financial Times had this response, Zoran Mamdani is wrong. Billionaires should exist. He said, of course billionaires should exist. The Democratic Socialist candidate to be mayor of New York seems to think that the economy is a zero-sum game, where if you do better, it must mean that I do worse. This is profoundly mistaken. While amassing their fortunes, billionaires make the rest of us richer, not poorer. But this zero-sum, there was another thing in the Economist, this is the headline, to understand America today, study the zero-sum mindset. Let me just read this at the beginning of it. It says, look at the news or social media these days, and you might see a pattern. Stories are about groups in conflict, competing for limited resources, with the gains for some framed as losses for others. More and more, debates are shaped by a mindset that sees the world as a fixed pie, where one group's gain is another's loss. It goes on to say, we need to look at where this mentality comes from. It doesn't just come from nowhere. People, this is the article continues, people who have done better than their parents and experience upward mobility are less likely to think in zero-sum terms. This also explains why younger generations in America are more zero-sum. They've grown up during times of slower economic growth and lower mobility. Other rich countries exhibit a similar generational pattern. This is the OECD. It calls it at the end of it, the article saying, politicians need to look at this. We should have some more win-win policies. It's funny that the other Economist article is saying, like, put yourself in the position of a finance minister. There's nothing you can do. And this one's saying, maybe we should just do more win-win. So everyone can do better. But to me, this kind of gets to the heart of what we're saying with our perspectives. Actually, I mean, the world is a fixed pie. Globalization is over. And that's what that means. You don't have the expansion of markets anymore. And all of these new technologies, the new industries that are arising, that's competition for a very small number of powers in the world. But when the volume of trade was expanding in the post-war, you had new industries, new markets, new territories to incorporate into the global market, new populations that were coming into it after the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Restoration of capitalism in China. There was that gave it expanse. And when you have expansion, that's when that mechanism of capitalism basically creates an environment. It's like the capitalist will say, tomorrow the market's going to be bigger than it is today. So it makes sense to invest in the future. That's no longer the horizon that they see. So they're not going to invest. They have nothing to kind of look forward to, which is why they're pouring it all into stock buybacks, and they're basically just parasitically just absorbing that in their own bank accounts. The size of the investment that you need for the cutting edge industries, if you look at the past, steam power was very important at one time for international balance of power. Railroads, steel, coal, right? In the 20th century was oil, the auto industry, and then who has the oil becomes the big question. Now the global scramble is for AI. You need massive computing power to do that. You need like data centers, and you need microchips, superconductors. On top of this, you have renewable energies and rare earths. These are basically, this is the imperialist scramble of our time. But the amount of investment that you need, the amount of capital to even participate in the game is so great that the Europeans can't afford it. Europe is screwed because it's 27 little ruling classes, each with their own interests. They don't have one big bank that has all of their capital united, or one centralized power that can, marshal that capital towards one purpose and make strategic decisions. What you need right now, these markets and these industries call for maximum capital, maximum concentration, and maximum centralization, which is what China and Russia have. China in particular, both have the birthmarks of former worker states. Consider that the relationship between the state in China and the ruling class is a very unique one. Most of the time, the bourgeoisie creates its state, and then it has control over it. The bourgeoisie, the Chinese capitalists, didn't overthrow the state to restore capitalism. The Chinese bureaucracy allowed the bourgeoisie to come out onto the scene by its own mercy and within strict limits. And they have, it's state capitalism is what you have in China. And the US doesn't have this advantage that its rivals has. Its rivals basically have a secret weapon in the form of a very heavy-handed state that the US doesn't have in its toolbox. And this is why there's huge pressure on Trump to try and create a heavier-handed state than what you've had in previous administrations. This golden share of U.S. Steel gives the U.S. administration the power to outvote all other shareholders on basically any decision-making with U.S. Steel, what they're going to do with the plants, the workers' salaries even. In July, the Defense Department bought the largest stake in MP Materials, a rare earth mining company, for $400 million in taxpayer money. That's basically like a 15% nationalization of that company. NVIDIA and Advanced Micro Devices, AMD, they were barred from selling chips to China until they offered to give Trump a 15% cut of the revenue that they made from those sales. Trump has taken a 10% share of Intel. That's worth $11 billion. People are calling that the biggest state intervention since the 2008 bailout. But if that's part of a grant that the CHIPS Act under Biden had provided to Intel, which has been turned from just a grant into like actual shares that are now purchased by the U.S. government. At this time that basically Intel is getting partly bailed out by the government, its stock price is still 60% lower than what it was 25 years ago. Intel comes from the early 2000s. This was a computer chip maker from a world where you still had floppy disks, and it hasn't been competitive in the smartphone world or but it's like a grandpa company and it needs crutches now, and that's what this represents. but they're laying off 25,000 employees at this time when they're getting this big bailout. And then you have other interventions like Trump, truth social posts against, telling Walmart, eat the tariffs, threatening Apple that he's going to tariff Apple if they don't move operations over from India back to the U.S. So this is one of the things that conservative columnists are saying. Well, Mamdani says he wants to control the means of production, but Trump is saying he wants to be the major stakeholder in the means of production. So we're not comfortable with this. And Trump is doing socialism. The Daily also did an episode about Trump is changing American capitalism. And they talk about how Trump has made statements saying, this is just the beginning. We're just getting warmed up. We want to do a lot more of this. We want to move in this direction. People are like, what does this mean for American capitalism? But you can see why there's a pressure to do this in terms of these are the key industries that he's trying to compete with on the global stage against powers that have a huge amount of centralization and state power. Just to put this into perspective, in World War II, the US carried out real nationalizations of manufacturing, coal mines, railroads, oil refineries, telecommunications. These were some industries were taken over entirely. Even retail chains, Montgomery Ward's, department stores. All of this was taken. 3,000 different coal mines were nationalized during World War II. All arms manufacturing, including Smith & Wesson, was taken over. This is part of what allowed the U.S. to build up its productive capacity to fight the war and to come out with that productive capacity, at the disposal of the American capitalist class. In a sense, they did in World War II what the Chinese state has been doing for the last 20 years. Massive state investment is what created that big pool to build its productive capacity. Now, if the U.S. were to do this again, it would basically be taking a step not toward socialism, but toward state capitalism. But it can't be done. It certainly can't be done so easily in the U.S. as it's being done in China. For one, there's elections to worry about. You can't have a long-term. It's hard. You can hardly have a five-year plan if you don't know what's going to happen at the next election. She's been in power since 2012. Putin's been in since 1999. And so, you have this. This is another thing. Like bourgeois democracy isn't helping in this competition. Just to say that also the AI, a big part of investment isn't just like creating machines. It's also the research and the R&D that they're doing. But in 2000, the U.S. is spending 30 times more than China on R&D. Now it's about 1-to-1, but by purchasing power, China is spending double what the U.S. is doing. In terms of AI being one of these big races, 15 years ago, the U.S. had more than double the AI patents that China had. Now China has 70% and the U.S. has 14%. This is a graphic that I found that really puts it into perspective. Who's winning the AI patent race? So China is completely dominating. I mean, at least in terms of the big development. The U.S. is pouring a lot of money into it, but that doesn't really tell you all that much. The MIT came out with a report that found that 95% of the companies that are generating AI technology, the generative pilots, they're failing. Only 5% are turning a profit. So you can have billions of dollars being poured by venture capitalists into these businesses as a gamble, hoping they're going to strike it rich. But it doesn't actually tell you that this is going to help the U.S. to lead. After all, obviously, what China did with DeepSeek was basically achieve the same thing that ChatGPT can do with a fraction of the resources, a fraction of the computing power, a fraction of the chips, the power of the chips. Sam Altman of OpenAI has said that he thinks this is a bubble now. And there's a lot of headlines about this in big tech. The big tech stocks are mostly the top 10 stocks of the stock market. That's 40% of the stock market in the U.S. There's huge speculation taking place. And the question of how this is going to affect the broader economy and the broader working class, how many jobs this could eliminate, is another big question that's going to be a major thing. This is one of the things that's pulling MAGA coalition apart, because you have the working class populist base. Obviously, it doesn't align with the Silicon MAGA tech bros who are championing crypto and saying we want AI deregulation. They're worried about the job losses. And it's not just like the music of the future. These job losses are already happening. I mean, you have to the extent that you've had mass layoffs, it's been in tech. And to the extent that you have huge unemployment, It's for recent college grads, particularly computer science. I mean, that's where you have this slowdown. And think about, for the first time, this is one of the stats that Comrades were discussing this week, recent college graduates now have a higher unemployment rate than the general population. Recent college grads, those that spent years and tens of thousands of dollars to educate themselves and follow the rules with the hopes of doing something productive, society has no need for them and can't find a place for them. And they have they're the most desperate layer of society now. They're the ones that can't find a place to get plugged in with the market. What does that tell you about American capitalism? Can't find a role for them. I mean, this is, as you know, large numbers of young, educated workers with no future and no prospects is an explosive ingredient. The Wall Street Journal said a record low, 25% of people say they think they have a good chance of improving their standard of living. That's a record low since surveys started in 1987. More than 3/4 say they lack confidence that the next generation is going to live better. 70% of people say they believe the American dream, that if you work hard, you'll get ahead, no longer holds true or never did. That's the highest level in nearly 50 years of surveys. I think that's probably unprecedented. I mean, this is the result of all of these processes that we're talking about. I think, Comrades can come in about Indonesia, but one of the flammable ingredients in Indonesia was precisely having a large number of young, educated youth workers with no prospects and nothing to do. The Comrades on the ground could see this coming. They were describing this at the World Congress, that you could see various symptoms, like job openings would attract thousands of people who would line up around the blocks. And they would have, some of these jobs that would attract huge numbers were like street sweeper. And people were quoted in the line saying, well, yeah, I'd rather be a street sweeper than to live on the street. This is the level of desperation that young people, they were saying that the most popular book right now, the bestseller among young people, is a fiction book inspired by the 1998 revolution. This was all in, early August when we were in Italy. I mean, you could see they could see very clearly what was about to happen. In February, you had Dark Indonesia. This was a short-lived movement, mostly of young people also. It wasn't quite on the scale that we're seeing now, but the new president, Prabowo, was elected in November last year, with a landslide victory and a supermajority in the parliament. He was talking about gold in Indonesia. We're going to develop Indonesia, and we're going to become one of the strong powers in the world. And then he starts in with harsh austerity. Cuts to every single ministry. Meanwhile, what really kicked it off a few weeks ago, in the middle of last month, was when ministers gave themselves a $3,000 raise at a time when most workers are earning less than $300 a month. And that's what set off the social explosion. And then when you had this 21-year-old delivery driver, Afan Kurniawan, killed, being rammed by a tactical vehicle of the police, that's what really transformed the protest into a nationwide insurrection. I mean, there's no other word for what's happening right now. They're calling for the dissolution of parliament. Members of parliament are having their mansions raided and looted, stormed by protesters. One of these members of parliament that called the protesters, it's like they put do you have anything to say about the protesters that are calling for the dissolution of parliament? And he says, yeah, I would say that they are the stupidest people on earth. And then he finds that his home is stormed by thousands of people who are live streaming themselves, taking a $600,000 watch out of his bedroom. I mean, this is this has happened to the finance minister of the country and to various other members of the state. Not only that, their prime target, they've burnt down the parliamentary buildings throughout the region. Indonesia is actually it's a pretty huge spread out country. It's got a massive population, 284 million. It's the fourth largest country in the world by population, right after the United States. There's regional parliamentary buildings. 37 of them have been stormed, have been burnt or damaged to some extent. That's as of a week ago. By now, maybe they've hit the 40. The protesters have burnt down not one police station, not 50, but hundreds of police stations. They've burnt them down across the country. I mean, what this shows you is that a revolution is unfolding. It doesn't have a leadership, but their slogan is dissolve parliament. Our small forces are putting forward a program calling for a general strike, bring the revolution into the factories, organize this as a force that has, self-organization of the working class independent organization, workers' defense guards. And basically the comrades, what they're putting forward is the only way forward. The only way that this revolution could succeed is being communicated by our very limited forces. But of course, we don't have the comrades we don't have the numbers required to reach the masses with that message. I think the same thing was around the corner for France. These massive social explosions. You know, what's needed, you could see that we're moving into a situation where people would be completely open to a revolutionary program. Every move that they're making is showing they want a class war, and they want that class war to escalate. The anger isn't finding a channel, it's not finding a leadership that can show where it would move forward. But I think in the long run, the point of all of these perspectives is that these scenes are the logical outcome of the entire situation. The ruling class has no way to avoid this same fate. They can't avoid what's happening in Indonesia, happening at a certain point in the OECD countries, happening at a certain point in every country on earth, because their system, the exhaustion of its system, is something that they have no control over. They cannot reverse that. And that's the meaning of the crisis of capitalism. I think if we can help the comrades understand history is locked into this trajectory. It's a matter of time before we're faced with a revolutionary explosion on the order of Indonesia today. And it's all a question of having our forces prepared to be able to intervene in it, to play our role in history. Cure for a headache. All of these are Democrats. It's kind of nuts, right? I mean, they're talking about him like he's a cancer that's coming and taking over their party. And I think actually that is the way that the ruling class looks at this threat within the Democratic Party.
Yeah. And I think we're going to get into that throughout this episode, but it raises an essential question. Should socialists be running in the Democrats in the first place? And we've argued for years, we've contributed to this debate that's been unfolding in the newly revived socialist movement in the US. We've been contributing to this debate and saying that the Democrats are a dead end and that they don't see socialism as like a valid programmatic, direction to go in. They see it as correct. I mean, from their point of view, they're a capitalist party. So they see this as a problem to be stopped. They want to nip this in the bud. They do not want, they're not open to this kind of thing. So yeah, clearly, within just weeks of a socialist successfully winning a primary, you see this kind of response. You also see Cuomo, who's a entrenched, Democratic, leader, as they put it, for New York State. He's not afraid to break party discipline to run independently. They're going to use all possible, tactics to try to nip this in the bud.
Well, obviously one of the reasons for breaking with the Democrats is that the Democratic establishment is actively trying to strangle what Zoran represents, the way they did with Bernie Sanders in 2016 and in 2020. Like, you can see that the party top, it's not a neutral body. It's not an empty vessel that can just be filled with socialist content or capitalist content. It is an institution historically created, funded, controlled, shaped by Wall Street.
Yeah, it doesn't even have branches or any it's an electoral machine. And so socialists can sometimes try to get in there, but they have all kinds of mechanisms to retain control over the party.
And the ruling class's attitude is now they need to retain that control more than ever, because from their perspective, it's like the GOP has fallen to Trumpism. So that's not really a reliable, predictable pillar that they can rest on and help them govern in their interest. It's a bit erratic. It's up to Trump. So that means that the only other pillar that they have is the Democratic Party, and they want to keep it. They have to keep it that way.
Yeah.
They can't allow the Democrats to go the way of Trumpism.
Exactly, and they are worried and they see the kind of symbolism of the mayor of the largest city in the country, a Democratic-controlled city for decades and decades, if Zoran Mamdani is kind of setting that standard, as they put it, that's it raises the possibility of these kind of candidates, again, being emboldened and trying to take things in that direction. But again, there's a conflict because socialism, it's a program for the working class, and this is a capitalist party, and so the whole kind of situation, if you have socialists running the Democrats pretty quickly, as we're seeing immediately, it forces a conflict. And I think for all Zoran gets right, for the fact that, or another thing we should talk about, compared to any other mainstream politician, or most others at least, he is a consistent pro-Palestinian candidate, and I think that was another thing that that people liked about him. We could talk more about that. For all he gets right, it's clear that he doesn't see the Democratic Party as something that's controlled by the ruling class and something that has to be fought, I think, or at least that's not what he's saying. There's an NPR interview where he was asked basically something to the effect that many of the quote-unquote leaders of the Democratic Party, people like Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, these kinds of people, haven't endorsed him. And the interviewer asked him, what do you make of that? What do you say to that? And his response, he said something along the lines of basically that our campaign is approaching it the way we've approached every day, which is that we have to earn it. And he said, I want to earn the support of our party's leaders. And said, basically he was saying that he wants to win them over to this outlook that the solution to prosperity and to thriving in New York is his program. I think what he should have said is, well, of course they haven't endorsed me because this campaign and this movement around it is in opposition to the interests that the Democratic Party represents. And so I'm not surprised they haven't endorsed me. I don't expect them to endorse me. I don't particularly want them to endorse me. That would be a class war attitude. That would be saying, this party is controlled by the capitalists, and we need to fight them in order to realize this kind of program, in order to get free buses, affordable childcare, freeze the rent. It's going to take a fight. I think that would be the message that is necessary. That's a realistic message, because obviously they're going to try to halt his program at every step.
Yeah, it's a question of what kind of, and this gets to the heart of the strategy thing. It's it's not that we just have a fixation with breaking with the Democrats and having an independent ballot line, as if it's just an organizational detail of who cares if he's running as an independent or running as a Democrat. In fact, here's this is a common comment. There's one person said, I disagree that running as a Democrat blurs the line. Later on they say, you can run as a Democrat without being a Democrat. And this is kind of the thing, is that sometimes they think, it's just a detail. It's it's a technical aspect. And clearly, Zoran Mamdani is a different type of politician than most of what you see in the Democratic Party, so that's true. One thing we should get into is that other type of enemy that he's got, which is the people that are striking a friendly pose, trying to put their arm around Zoran and say, good job, buddy, this is great, you're revitalizing the party, let me show you how things are done in the halls of power. And they're basically saying, there are rules to this game. And that's actually what we're getting at, is there are rules to the game. And you can't simply ignore those rules. You can't make up your own rules with politics. You can have class politics with revolutionary intentions, which means you're leaning on the working class as an independent base, and you have a combative attitude and a plan for fighting against those obstacles. Or, if you, in the absence of that, the only other thing you have is bourgeois politics and its own logic, which is there are rules. If you want to get things passed, well, there was one person that was saying, it was the head of the Democratic Party in New York, saying rhetoric and organizing isn't going to get laws passed. You need relationships. And this is kind of getting to the heart of it, isn't it?
Yeah, if your outlook is not, we need a no-holds-barred war against the capitalists in both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, you're trying to kind of please all sides, please both sides, the capitalists and the workers, which can't be done. They have opposed interests, but if you're trying to do that, you're not leaning on the strength of the working class, and so inevitably the only other option is to seek support in some layer of the capitalist class. And I think that is what we're starting to see. I mean, I do want to start just again to give credit where credit is due. A few examples of how Zoran does differ very much from normal politicians. I think a couple days after his initial primary victory, he was asked on CNN.
Do you like capitalism?
No, I have many critiques of capitalism.
That was probably a breath of fresh air for millions of people. Went viral on Twitter. It was to see someone who isn't afraid to to criticize capitalism and without any apologize.
Saying that.
Yeah, obviously, and actually, a couple years back, I remember there was a town hall. Nancy Pelosi was asked, "Is there room for socialism in the Democratic Party?" or something like that, and she plainly said,
I have to say, we're capitalist. And that's just the way it is.
That's the view of the Democratic Party. But Zoran, of course, he does come from the Democratic Socialists of America. He's a socialist himself, and so he said that. So I think that was good. I think that's the way he should respond to that kind of question. But you do see how even just a few weeks of being the primary victor, having all these pressures weighing on you, all of these people trying to show you how to be realistic and everything, and the pressure of the general election, he is starting to moderate certain points, and I think that has to be acknowledged. A couple weeks ago, he was asked in an interview to condemn the slogan "Globalize the Intifada," and at the time he said,
That's not language that I use. I don't believe that the role of the mayor is to police speech.
and I think we should say, of course, what does "Globalize the Intifada" mean? It's a pro-Palestinian rights slogan. Intifada in Arabic means popular uprising or shaking off, literally. It refers to the first Intifada, especially in 1987, which was a popular uprising of the oppressed against their oppressors. And so and Zoran has, again, to give him credit, he has correctly acknowledged that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, that it's an apartheid type regime. These kinds of things that certainly the Democratic Party as a whole is not going to acknowledge. So that's something that's refreshing. And he initially wouldn't disavow the slogan "Globalize the Intifada," but last week I think it was, he had attended some kind of closed-door meeting with 150 business leaders, or as the New York Times described it, something like that. And he did turn around on that and said he would discourage people from using that.
That distance between what some intend and what others hear is a bridge that is too far. And it is why I have not used the phrase, and it is why I discourage its use.
So that's a clear example of kind of the price you pay for having this attitude of trying to please everyone and trying to work with the capitalists instead of waging an unrelenting struggle against them.
Yeah, and throwing it back in their face and saying, this is part of a slander that nobody believes. All of this, it's kind of an extension of saying the whole Palestine solidarity movement is about anti-Semitism. That's what the establishment is pumping out, this vitriolic lie. And he should say that's a lie.
Yeah.
And this is not about anti-Semitism, and the Intifada is not about violence against Jews. That is a lie, He should say the only way to stop this genocide is going to be with a revolution, and that's what I'm in favor of, And if he said that, he would be standing firm on that point. But yeah, it's a question of how can he please both the working class that wants to see a fight against billionaires and also a room full of billionaires.
Exactly. And by the way, if he said that, I think all the millions of people in and around New York City and across the country who support Palestine, that's the kind of response they want to see. Because again, like you said, everyone knows it's slander when they insinuate that anti-Israel views are anti-Semitic. Everyone knows that. The media knows that. And so I think but if he would just plainly state that, he would get a good response. Of course, that would be tantamount to declaring war on the establishment of the Democratic Party, and so it does show how he would only be able to lean on his supporters and the movement behind him, and not try to build relationships as the other people are advising him to do.
That's the whole thing about class independence and class politics, is that it would make him more enemies, and he wouldn't go into that room of executives and then kind of schmooze and get along with them and and he wouldn't be trying to say, we're going to unite all New Yorkers, he would have a much more combative tone, and his attitude would be, we're uniting the working class of New York against the billionaires of New York. We're not here to unite all New Yorkers.
It can't be done.
It cannot be done, yeah.
There's a class divide in society.
And it's based on, I mean, this is a basic Leninist position that's based on a Marxist view of society. Like, if you understand class conflict, you're not going to get these reforms without crossing the line of private property, without taking some chunk of the surplus value out of the hands of the capitalists and bringing it back into the pockets of the working class. Like, there was an article in the Financial Times saying Zoran Mamdani is wrong. Of course, billionaires should exist. This is another thing he said on an interview in Meet the Press.
Do you think that billionaires have a right to exist?
I don't think that we should have billionaires because, frankly, it is so much money in a moment of such inequality.
Good, we agree with that. And then later he kind of walks it back and says,
and ultimately, what we need more of is equality across our city and across our state and across our country. And I look forward to work with everyone, including billionaires, to make a city that is fairer for all of them.
He's kind of trying to have it both ways. I think it should be a real class politics approach would be to say billionaires are essentially the parasites of this society. They suck the wealth that's exploited from the labor of the working class. They're not productive members of society. They're actually leeching this wealth off at the top, and society doesn't need to have a class of people that play that role. We can give them productive jobs. We can give them real jobs after a revolution, but we're not trying to work with them and make something that works together through just tweaking the policy and having... Here's another thing, the taxes, the tax proposal. He goes into this meeting with 150 executives, and he said on, I think it was the NPR interview, you know, what do you say to wealthy New Yorkers who fear and oppose your candidacy? And he said, I'm going to have the chance to win them over. And I'm going to explain to them that taxes, higher taxes is going to help them retain talent. It's like you're going to go into a room full of billionaires and say, we're going to raise taxes on you. You're going to lose hundreds of millions of dollars, but you know, a rising tide lifts all ships, and we're all going to be better off for it. And are they going to just accept that? I mean, and Kathy Hochul has already said there's not going to be any tax increase. The governor has veto power over it. I mean, this is a real obstacle that he's up against. It's not that we're attacking Zoran for his policies. We're just kind of explaining these policies are going to go up against a brick wall. You know, and class politics is you have to recognize the wall if you're going to smash through it, and you have to understand what are the rules of a political approach that can't smash through it. You know, it would be only the working class that would be able to do that.
Yeah, this makes me think. I mean, in 2021, there was a YDSA conference that Zoran spoke at, Democratic Society of America Youth Wing, and he did, to his credit, again, he said the purpose, or I'll just read it. He said, "What the purpose of this entire project is not simply to raise class consciousness, but to win socialism." We agree with that. You know, when we engage in electoral politics, it's not just for the sake of it, it's with the goal of achieving socialism. And he says we have to be unapologetic about our socialism. So I think that has been his kind of starting point. And again, he has gone further than many have in that respect. But without a program, without an outlook of no compromise, no possibility of pleasing everyone, no compromise of the capitalists, but war against them, eventually you start sliding, tacking to the right, basically. And it's not a question of intentions, I would say. It's a question of programmatic outlook.
Well, and it's not just that we're saying that he's like not socialist enough for us, he's not radical enough. Like, here's one of the comments that gets made. Here's one person says, "Can't y'all just be optimistic and support and celebrate that his class-focused program could potentially revolutionize New York and improve people's material conditions, at least on some small level?" I.e., people are like, this is at least a step forward. Like, maybe it's not the full revolution, but it's a step in the right direction. Can we celebrate? And our critique of his platform and his political methods, it's not simply that it doesn't go far enough. You know, we're not just saying either it's a full-blown revolutionary program or bust. You know, we're not saying like it has to be purity politics or this kind of. We're interested in partial steps forward. We're interested in any little thing that inches things forward. if it actually is moving forward towards a goal, right? And for us, how do you measure if something is actually moving forward, like towards a strategic goal? In our view, that would mean the working class has to be separated politically from the other class. Like, working class politics means saying the workers have interests that are different from the billionaires' interests. And we're not going to unite all New Yorkers. We're going to cleave a section against the other. You know, we can't rely on their party. We can't rely on their laws. We can't rely on their political outlook or the rules that they apply to how city council should be run, or Congress for that matter. Like, all of these things, if you don't break with that mentality, if you don't break with those parameters, then you're going to be constrained by them. Like, the ruling class will have a grip on Zoran Mamdani. And as an individual, however well-intentioned he may be, he's not going to be able to break that grip, especially if he's not relying on the working class and mobilizing it to fight. Like, he would have to treat the working class as a battering ram to break the resistance of the billionaires of this city. Now, if you were talking about doing that, even as a Democrat, that would be a different thing. I mean, if we saw him like taking that combative language, I think we would take a second look at that and say, like, this is significant, you know, like if he actually were on a trajectory towards breaking with the Democrats, which a lot of people have hope that he will, that would be interesting, you know, but there's no sign of that right now.
No, on the contrary. I mean, again, he talks about our party all the time, and this is a subtle thing, but I think that does, you know, basically it reinforces a very widespread illusion, which is that the Democrats are somehow more worker friendly than the Republicans. That's not true. And when I mean, even running in the party blurs that, or kind of implies that the Democrats can be worked with. Talking about our party basically is implying that the socialist movement should see this as our party. I think that's just clearly not true. And what we're saying is we need a realistic program. We need to start with, how does capitalist society really function? What benefits the working class, eats into the profits of the capitalist class, and what benefits the capitalist class hurts the working class. We have to recognize that divide. I don't think most of the time, I don't think the way Zoran talks about his program makes that clear. I mean, he actually, at some point he said this campaign is about affordability and using the tools that the city government has to create affordability, or something like that.
Like it's a policy choice.
Yeah, that's an illusion. Yeah, it's not a policy choice. I mean, that's basically the way liberals put it forward, is that there's different policy tweaks you can make, and that's going to make the system work better or worse. It reinforces the illusion that capitalism can be easily tweaked, when that's clearly not the case. It's not about, if we want to win free buses, rent freeze, affordable childcare, it's not just going to be using some tools and some small policy changes. It's going to take class war. It's going to take, as we've been saying, a mass mobilization of his supporters of the working class against the business leaders of New York City, the capitalist class. But again, he's talking about learning from the business community. There's a New York Times article yesterday which kind of summarized some of the shifts he's already made. It said, last week, Mr. Mamdani met separately with skeptical members of the Partnership for New York City and with black business executives. They grilled him over his socialist economic agenda. And then it says, basically, it's the New York Times summing up some of the policy shifts that he's made. And it says, billionaires shouldn't exist. Mr. Mamdani walked that back. A rent freeze for stabilized units? Yes, but it was a policy he might revisit after 4 years. His refusal to repudiate the term globalize the intifada, that too came under some revision. So you see these pressures.
And the New York Times is clocking this. Like, they're saying he was running with a really radical rhetoric, and now, like, maybe we can work with this guy. Like, he's walking these things back. I think that, going back to the point you were making, there is no possibility for substantially raising people's standard of living, raising the working class's standard of living, while also leaving the complete domination of the capitalists untouched, while leaving their profit levels untouched. Like, there is no ability, you can't magically have a creative and clever tax policy that will allow everyone to live better, and nobody takes a hit, basically, because this is a class society. And the reason that standard of living has been falling for decades, for generations, in the United States ever since the end of the post-war boom, is because the capitalist system is in decline, and in the balance of forces, the capitalist class has been squeezing the working class. And the only way to reverse that, as you're saying, is through class war, which would mean taking a bigger slice of the pie out of the hands of the capitalists. And I think that's the reason that, when he's saying, like, we're going to cap rents and we're going to make groceries more affordable, and we're just going to have a big tent that's political unity around the demand for affordability. Communists can get behind the demand for affordability. We're just saying, what is the obstacle in the way of affordability? It's the capitalist system, it's capitalist profits, it's capitalist markets, it's private property. Those are the things that actually stand in the way. And if he were to threaten anything, even modestly, that goes against the interests of the capitalist class, you can just imagine the response that, the retaliation that would ensue. You would have threats of capital flight. The businesses would, and they're already threatening this kind of thing, like, oh, he's anti-business. The businesses are going to flee the city. We're going to pull our investment out. You would have also economic sabotage. They would make it so that you have a dysfunctional economy, and it can be blamed on him, and the political backlash could be used to get him out. You would have all kinds of legal lawsuits that get him all tied up in the courts, and they'd say he can't threaten our business prosperity this way. They would have all kinds of lawsuits, not to mention that the courts would come down on the side of the businesses. The governor would intervene. She's already threatened to. The federal government's going to intervene. Trump's not going to increase funding for New York City. Like, these are all the obstacles that are awaiting. And so, again, when we say he would need a class independent program against us, again, it's not just like break from the Democrats in order to break free from their political influence. It's also, once you're against the ropes and once you're locked into a conflict, how do you actually fight that conflict if you have no party of your own that's willing to go into this fight with you? Because I can tell you now, the rest of the Democrats in city council are not going to back him in a conflict against the businesses of the city. The only thing he would be able to do is mobilize people in the streets, which would be the class war method.
Yeah, this makes me think of another part. This same article in the New York Times from yesterday, Mamdani victory could represent expansion of the left's influence. It's basically looking at how the DSA sees this as a kind of a watershed moment because this is a significant victory, but it raises the question of what to do in that position. And the same basic thing comes up. They actually talk about, they quote from Alexa Aviles, councilwoman in Brooklyn, who's a member of the DSA. And I think what she said kind of gets to the heart of the matter. She says, they're talking about how Zoran has considered leaving Tish as the police commissioner, is it?
Jessica Tish. Yeah.
Jessica Tish, of the Tish fortune.
They're worth $10 billion.
$10 billion.
A billionaire in charge of the the NYPD, policing in the interest of the billionaires.
Right.
One of their own.
Which is another. It's another statement Zoran made, kind of walking some of his previous rhetoric back, or kind of giving a nod to the capitalists that he's not going to totally dismantle their whole setup here in New York.
Yeah, he was praising Tish.
Yeah.
Considering keeping her as commissioner, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. He praised Bloomberg too in this meeting. And again, I don't think he sees it as he's trying to he's taking their advice, build relationships. These are irreconcilable classes. They're not gonna kind of allow him to raise taxes on them because he's charming them, and that's not how class society works. But in any case, so Aviles said that she found Tish's policies to be troubling, but she acknowledged that governing requires a delicate balance between ideology and compromise.
And Aviles is a DSA candidate as
right.
well, or DSA member of office, right?
Yeah, and she said all executives have to operate within a structure, and you will have to modulate because that is just the nature of the beast.
You'll have to modulate, huh?
Yes. And if you accept capitalism as something that can't be overthrown, this is just how it is, we can maybe try to make some reforms, that might be true. That is the nature of capitalism. But it gets to a question of reformism versus revolution. We need a program that breaks with the logic of capitalism, that doesn't try to accommodate to what the capitalists need, but seeks to overthrow capitalism altogether. So it's true. I mean, this is the whole thing. Revolutionary politics, we lean only on the working class, only and its own organizations, its own party, its own funding, all of this, a class-independent approach of class war. If you don't have that approach, if you're a reformist, whether you're well-intentioned or not, and we have no reason to doubt any of these people have bad intentions, but if you have a reformist perspective, the only option that leaves you is to try to lean on some section of the capitalists, and so that's already what's starting to happen here. But as we've seen, they themselves are quite a vicious, class-conscious enemy, and they're not gonna, I don't think they're gonna budge. They're gonna fight Zoran tooth and nail.
Absolutely, and just to be clear, like, it's not that we're counterposing the fight for reforms against revolution,
right?
And saying that you have to pick either you fight for improvements or you fight to overthrow the system. No, the fight for improvements is part of the struggle to overthrow the system. It's part of the struggle to create a sense of class independence politically, where the working class has to recognize that workers have their own interests separate from those of the capitalists, and these interests are locked in a conflict, and workers can only rely on our own strength. We have to unite as workers against the capitalists, and that means fighting with our own methods, strike activity, mass demonstrations in the streets, and all of this. But it's also like, even the fight for reforms, people are concerned about, we want achievable material improvements in the living standards of the working class. Great, we're totally on board with that. It's not that we're against that, and we're not saying wait for the revolution and then we're going to give you these reforms. We're saying you need class politics and class independent methods, i.e. you need class war methods in order just to achieve those reforms. And you're not going to achieve reforms within the limits of capitalism without class struggle. It's not going to happen. There's no miraculous, better version of capitalism waiting where everyone gets cash and prizes, including the billionaires, and everyone's happy and the capitalists are prosperous. That is not a possibility. But there is possibility for actually achieving a lot of these substantial reforms. Just one thing I've noticed, New York City is the most unequal city in the US, one of the most unequal cities in the world. There's the most billionaires and millionaires in the city of any city worldwide. There's 123 billionaires. Among them, they have $759 billion. That's probably just liquid assets. That's not counting the actual Fortune 500 capital that's here in the city. You have 350,000 millionaires in New York City. That's 1 in 24 New Yorkers. There's the same number of people who are millionaires as there are people who are homeless in New York City. That's nuts, right? Like, you have 200,000 people who are living doubled up in someone else's home. There's nearly 150,000 people who are living in shelters or on the streets. There's also, in the last few years, it was reported by the city that there's something like 90,000 vacant apartment units. So you have people in the streets, you have apartments sitting vacant, and it's all owned by private capitalists, some of them institutional, like hedge funds that are owning these things. Like, everything you need, the resources are clearly there, but what's standing in the way? Private ownership. If Zoran had a program that said, we're going to fix the housing problem, and we're going to do it by confiscating the vacant units that are just being speculated on because they're warehoused units. The last time they tried a rent control policy was in 2019, and they actually tried to lower rents, and what the private landlords did was take units off the market, and they called this warehousing them. Tens of thousands of units were brought off the market, and then there's a housing shortage, and that drives up prices, and then those apartments that are not rent stabilized become more expensive. And it's only something like 28%, it's exactly 28% of the housing stock in New York City that is rent stabilized. It's just 44% of apartments. Point is, the rent freeze is great. We want a rent freeze. A rent cap would be far better. A rent cap at like just 10% of income. But if you really want to solve the housing crisis, you need to be willing to nationalize, to expropriate that idle, those vacant units, And that means crossing a line that the Democratic Party would never be on board with. And you know what the landlords would do politically. This would be the beginning of a media war against him. And again, they would claim this is going to bankrupt the city and all of this stuff. How do you fight for it? You need to mobilize people in the streets. Imagine mass demonstrations. Can you imagine if he was actually putting forward like a class war program like this?
Yeah, he has those 50,000 volunteers who I
Yeah.
think would take to that. Like, could have
50,000.
mass demonstrations, rallies. I mean,
50,000 people marching down Fifth Avenue would be an incredible sight. They were willing to knock on doors for him. Why not mobilize in the streets and say, we are the workers of New York City and we're coming for the billionaires of the city. And we're not here to unite all workers around affordability, unite all New Yorkers. We're here to unite the working class against the capitalist class.
yeah, you could appeal to the whole working class of New York and say, if you want to fight against the rich, you want to fight against the billionaires, we're having a mass rally. That'd be first time in generations that something like that has happened in the U.S. And he could do this, and he has the prominence.
He absolutely could. The New York City Labor Council, by the way, just the unions in the AFL-CIO and SEIU here in the city, it's 1.2 million workers who are unionized. So he could call on them to join a new workers' party. Like the 50,000 that are already actively campaigning for him would be an excellent foundation for this party. Like that's a good nucleus. But it wouldn't be just limited to those 50,000. And 50,000 active door knockers, as the other candidates are seeing, is like it's a force to be reckoned with. Clearly, it made a big difference. But imagine if he actually called on 1.2 million workers to break from the Democrats, to form a working class. Can you imagine the electrifying effect that would have from coast to coast, worldwide, if he said, all right, the billionaires don't want to have this program, the Democrats don't want to have this program, the workers are going to form a party of their own, and we're going to fight for this.
Yeah, I mean, right now, on a nationwide level, on a national level, the Democrats have their lowest polling in many generations, or many decades at least. There's mass discontent with Trump. There was already about 50% of the country who was opposed to Trump from the beginning. There's fractures within Trumpism opening up right now.
MAGA's falling apart.
Yes, and that too has that's anti-establishment anger is what's behind that. Young people especially are rejecting both parties. In fact, there was recently the Gen Z approval rating for Trump just completely plummeted. And the pollsters who found this, they noted this is not translating into support for the Democrats. So especially among young people, although it's really all age groups. Never in recent memory has there been such hatred of both parties.
So on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. Again, my name is Dan Baker. I'm a combat veteran of the YPG International. This shirt shows one of my comrades who was killed fighting against ISIS, Jack Holmes. I met his parents in Rojava when I went there to fight against ISIS. Please like, share, and subscribe. There's a path to donations if you want to help me out so I can keep doing this. This is my daily daily routine of meditation, yoga, martial arts before I go to work, or in this case, I'm going out recruiting for the Revolutionary Communists of America that you've been listening to. And I am a representative of the Tallahassee cell of the Revolutionary Communists of America, and we are professional, disciplined communist revolutionaries who are aggressively recruiting and fundraising for our party while we are training new members and building up a professional core of cadres. So again, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow.